You know, people always ask me what it's like to work in a cemetery at night. They picture cloaks and fog machines and maybe a friendly, glowing skeleton waving from behind a marble angel. That's Hollywood nonsense. The truth is, it's mostly just cold and boring. Terribly, soul-crushingly boring. My name is Frank. For nearly 10 years, I was the night watchman at Greenwood Cemetery, just outside of Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's not the biggest place, but it's old. Really old. We're talking headstones from the Civil War era, leaning crookedly like tired old men waiting for the bus. Before we get into this story, I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, city or country. Now let's continue. I took the job because it was quiet and, frankly, I needed the steady paycheck. I'd punch in at 6 p.m., right when the sun was dipping below the horizon and painting the mausoleums gold and purple. Then I'd drive my beat-up Ford Ranger through the winding paths until 6 a.m. My job was simple. Keep the teenagers out, keep the vandals out, and make sure everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. And for the first 9 years, it was exactly that. Routine. I knew every broken fence post, every squirrel nest, every statue missing a nose. The dead. See? They don't bother you. They stay put. They're the quietest tenants you could ever ask for. You get used to the silence. You learn to appreciate the kind of deep, heavy silence that swallows up the world outside the cemetery gates. I'd spend most of the night sitting in the little maintenance shed, drinking coffee so strong it could dissolve steel, listening to the crackle of the old AM radio. Sometimes I'd walk the perimeter, the crunch of the gravel under my boots the loudest sound for miles. But then came the spring of 2018. That's when things stopped being boring. That's when the quiet stopped being peaceful and started feeling like a threat. It all started with Tommy Rourke. Now, Tommy Rourke was what you'd call a local character. Not the lovable kind. Tommy was the kind of guy who always had an angle, always owed someone money, and generally treated life like a game he was desperately trying to cheat at. He ran a dodgy used car lot on the edge of town, and rumor had it he'd done more than a few things that qualified as truly ugly business. He wasn't a murderer or anything that dramatic, but if there was cheap misery to be spread, Tommy Rourke was probably selling the shovel. He died fast. Heart attack, right in the middle of negotiating a terrible deal for a pickup truck. Poetic justice, maybe. The funeral was last Tuesday. It was a miserable day. Cold, spitting rain. The kind of weather that makes the clay soil of Greenwood turn into thick, greasy mud. The mood was tense. You could tell that even the few people who showed up weren't there out of grief, but out of some obligation they couldn't quite shake. The minister rushed the service. The pallbearers looked like they couldn't wait to drop the casket and run. I watched the whole thing from my truck, parked discreetly near the gate. When the crowd finally left, the grounds crew, a couple of weary guys named Dale and Marty, came over to finish the job. They had to use plywood just to keep the mud from swallowing the heavy machinery. It's a rule in the cemetery business. You always pack the dirt down tight. You mound it high because over time, that dirt is going to settle. A lot. You don't want a sudden sinkhole where a grave should be. Dale and Marty were professionals. They buried Tommy Rourke deep, covered him thoroughly, and packed the earth until it was a solid, muddy hillock, marked by a temporary wooden cross. I did my first patrol that night, checking the new grave site. Everything looked normal. It was a fresh mound, heavy and dark against the pale, wet grass. I didn't think about Tommy Rourke. I just thought about the cold. The next night, Wednesday, was different. I pulled into the cemetery just before sunset. The air was still heavy with moisture, but the rain had stopped. I grabbed my thermos and started my usual slow circuit. I was listening to a baseball game on the radio, Yankees versus Red Sox, nothing too exciting. When I got to the newer section where Tommy Rourke was laid to rest, I slowed the truck down. Now, remember what I told you about packing the dirt? It settles, but it settles slowly over weeks and months. It doesn't happen overnight, especially when the soil is this heavy clay. But Tommy Rourke's mound looked flatter than it should have been. I stopped the truck, killed the engine, and stepped out. The silence rushed in instantly, deafening. It was a moonless night, and the shadows were deep and black, cut only by the beam of my heavy-duty flashlight. I walked toward the grave. The ground was still slick, but the mound itself was strange. It wasn't just settled. It looked like the earth had exhaled. The peak was gone, and the soil was spread out, almost too wide. And there were cracks. Not little hairline cracks from drying, but deep, ragged fissures running across the top of the plot. They looked like stretch marks on the earth, like something had been trying to expand from the inside. Wind, I muttered to myself. Maybe the heavy machinery vibrated the dirt loose. I knelt down, shining the light directly onto the soil. That's when I saw the detail that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Right near the foot of the plot, the dirt wasn't just cracked, it looked pushed. The soil, which Dale and Marty had spent an hour tamping down, was loose, almost fluffy, like someone had just aerated it with a spade. I put my hand on the dirt, testing the consistency. It was cold, damp, and yielding. Too yielding. I stood up quickly, wiping the mud off my jeans. This wasn't settling. This was disturbance. I walked back to the truck, trying to rationalize it. A coyote? No. Coyotes dig for small animals, not 6 feet down into packed clay. A restless deer? Impossible. This was too uniform, too focused on the center of the grave. I drove away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the guys had packed it unevenly. I'd check it again in the morning and call Dale if it looked worse. I finished my rounds and retreated to the shed. I tried to focus on the baseball game, but the image of those fissures kept crawling into my thoughts. Around 1 a.m., the air dropped about 10 degrees. A sudden, sharp chill that felt unnatural even for an Iowa night. I pulled on my heavier jacket and decided I needed to stretch my legs. I drove the Ranger back out to the newer section, trying to look casual about it, like I was just doing a standard patrol. When I rounded the corner of the Smith family mausoleum, I saw it. And this time, there was no denying that something was profoundly wrong. The mound was lower still, significantly lower. It looked like the ground had just swallowed a substantial portion of the dirt. But that wasn't the worst part. The heavy, temporary wooden cross that marked Tommy Rourke's head was leaning at a sharp, impossible angle. It wasn't leaning into the grave like it had fallen. It was leaning out, pushed away from the center of the plot. I parked 50 feet away and approached on foot, my flashlight beam shaking just slightly in my grip. When I reached the edge of the plot, I didn't even need the light to see the new development. I could feel it under my shoes. The ground was vibrating. It wasn't the deep rumble of heavy machinery or the shake of a distant truck. It was a low, steady tremor coming directly from beneath my feet. It felt like a massive, slow heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I froze. I'm a man of facts, a man who believes in thermodynamics and gravity. I don't believe in spooky stuff. But this was defying physics. There was nothing down there but a concrete vault and a wooden casket, nothing that could generate a rhythmic vibration. I shined the light down, and the sight nearly made me drop the heavy mag light. The whole mound was breathing. The surface of the dirt was subtly rising and falling in time with the vibration. It wasn't a huge movement, maybe an inch or two, but it was undeniable. The dirt would puff up slightly, then settle, then puff up again, like a huge lung trying to expel something. And then I heard the sound. It was faint, muffled by 6 feet of heavy clay, but it was absolutely distinct. It sounded like something hard dragging across concrete. Screech! Thud. It wasn't settling. It was scraping. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled backward a step, tripping slightly over a low stone marker. My mind raced, trying to find a normal explanation. Water main break? No mains run through the middle of the plots. Earthquake? No, the trees weren't shaking, and the air was still. I forced myself to be logical. If something was moving underground, it had to be the vault itself. Maybe the vault wasn't sealed properly and the pressure of the water was shifting it. But the sound I heard next wasn't structural. It was organic. It was a wet, heavy sucking noise, like thick mud being pulled apart, followed by a sound that made me physically gag. A low, resonant groan. It sounded like the earth itself was struggling. I stood there paralyzed, watching the dirt rise and fall. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the vibration wasn't coming from the vault. It was coming from inside the vault. And whatever was inside that box, the earth was trying desperately to push it back out. I needed to call someone. The police? No. What would I tell them? The dirt is breathing, officer. The ground superintendent, Dale? Yes, Dale. He'd know about soil conditions. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with sudden sweat despite the freezing air. Just as I raised the phone to dial, the breathing stopped. The heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump ceased. The vibration died away. The silence returned, heavier and darker than before. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it was over. Maybe the pressure had equalized or whatever. I kept the flashlight trained on the plot, waiting for any movement. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then, the dirt near the center of the mound didn't rise. It erupted. A spray of wet, dark soil shot up about a foot into the air, like a violent sneeze. It wasn't a wide spray. It was narrow and focused, right over where the chest of the coffin would be. When the dirt fell back down, it revealed a hole, maybe the size of a dinner plate, leading straight down into the blackness. A smell hit me then. It wasn't the smell of death, not rot. It was the smell of something ancient and metallic, like rusty iron mixed with sulfur, and the overpowering, sickly sweet scent of disturbed clay. It was the smell of the deep earth being violently breached. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on that black hole in the ground. And then, from the darkness of the hole, came a sound that made me drop the phone and the flashlight, leaving me standing blind under the cold stars. It was a voice. Not a full word, not a shout, but a thick, guttural whisper, completely muffled by the wet soil and the air rushing up from the depths. It said one thing, and it was enough to make me turn and run faster than I ever have in my life. The whisper was rough, wet, and filled with utter despair. No, not here. I didn't stop running until I hit the gravel path 50 yards away. I didn't care about the darkness, the uneven ground, or the fact that I was stumbling over century-old curbings. All I could hear was that wet, desperate sound, that whisper clawing its way up from the clay. No, not here. I slammed against the side of the Ranger, breathing like I'd just run a marathon carrying a refrigerator. My heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest cavity. My flashlight and phone were back there, 50 feet away, sitting right next to a hole that was talking. If I left them, I was admitting I was crazy, or worse, negligent. I needed those tools. And I needed to know, absolutely needed to know, that the earth hadn't just swallowed them whole. I took 3 deep, ragged breaths. Frank, you are a professional night watchman. You deal with drunk kids and broken gates. You do not deal with the metaphysical. You go back, you grab your gear, and you drive back to the shed and try to convince yourself you fell asleep and dreamt the whole thing. Turning back was the hardest thing I have ever done. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to get in the truck and drive through the front gate and never look back at Cedar Falls, Iowa, again. But I forced myself. Step by slow step, I walked back toward the plot. The hole was still there. A perfect black circle in the center of the grave. The air around it was still thick with that metallic, sulfuric smell. I reached down quickly, snatching the heavy maglite first. The light beam sprang to life, steadying my nerves slightly. I pointed it at the hole. Nothing moved. It was just a hole. a dark, empty hole in the ground. Then I grabbed the phone, which had fallen face down in the mud. I checked the screen. No cracks, no calls made, just a normal, boring phone. I stood up, backing away slowly, never taking the beam off the dirt. The silence now was absolute. Even the usual night noises, the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of the highway, seemed to have fled the area. I got back into the Ranger, locked the doors, and drove. Not fast, but deliberately, putting distance between me and the Rourke plot. I spent the next 4 hours in the maintenance shed, huddled under the single bare light bulb. I didn't touch the coffee. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat there, watching the digital clock count down to 6 a.m. The logical part of my brain kept trying to argue with the primal terror. It was an acoustic anomaly, Frank. The shape of the vault, the wet clay, the way the air shifted. It made the settling earth sound like a voice. But that didn't explain the breathing, or the eruption, or the smell. When the first sliver of weak morning light finally filtered through the windows, I felt a physical wave of relief wash over me. Daylight. Daylight fixes everything. The first thing I did was call Dale, the grounds superintendent. I didn't wait until he got to the office. I called his home number at 6:05 a.m. "Dale," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "It's Frank. Look, I'm still out here finishing up the shift, but I need you to get Marty out here immediately. That new Rourke plot?" "What about it, Frank? Did the kids get in?" Dale sounded groggy and annoyed. "Worse than kids. The settling is extreme, unprecedented. It looks like the vault failed. There's a localized sinkhole, about a foot wide, right in the center. And the smell, Dale, the smell of the disturbed earth is bad, really metallic. I think you might have a seal failure." I chose my words carefully. A failed vault was a maintenance issue. A breathing grave that talked was a ticket to the psychiatric ward. Dale grumbled but promised to send Marty out with the small backhoe and some specialized concrete mix. I waited until Marty showed up around 7:30 a.m. Marty was a big guy, worked slow, but he was thorough. I drove him out to the plot. Marty walked right up to the grave, squinting in the hazy morning light. The hole was less dramatic in the daytime, but it was still undeniably there. A clean puncture in the earth. Marty whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. That didn't just settle, Frank. That's a blowout." "See? I told you," I said, trying to sound authoritative rather than terrified. Marty knelt down and poked the edges of the hole with a shovel. "Vault must have cracked right on the lid. Either the pressure was too much or—" He paused, frowning. "Or what?" I asked. "Or the seal failed and something inside shifted hard. Look at this dirt, Frank." He scooped up a handful of the soil that had erupted the night before. "It's not just wet, it's light. Like it was pushed up from below with force. Clay doesn't do this." He looked at me, his eyes serious. "Did you hear anything last night?" I swallowed. "Just the usual, wind. But I felt the ground vibrate for a minute, maybe an hour before sunrise. Thought maybe a heavy truck was passing on the highway." He nodded slowly, accepting the lie. "Yeah, well, we're going to have to stabilize this. We'll fill the cavity with a fast-set grout, and then repack the rest. If the vault is cracked, that's Rourke family's problem. But we can't have sinkholes in the middle of the cemetery." I watched Marty work for a few minutes, the mundane sound of the shovel scraping dirt restoring a tiny bit of sanity. I left him to it, clocked out, and drove home. But I couldn't rest. The image of that hole, and the sound of that voice, "No, not here," kept cycling through my mind. Why was the earth rejecting Tommy Rourke? I spent the afternoon on my ancient desktop computer, doing something I'd never done before, researching Tommy Rourke. I didn't look up his used car business. I looked up his history. It wasn't hard. Tommy Rourke had a paper trail thicker than a phone book. He'd been involved in scams, fraud, and a couple of nasty civil lawsuits, but nothing that screamed damned soul. He was just a low-grade crook. I found one old newspaper clipping from about 30 years ago. It was a story about a land dispute. Tommy Rourke had bought a piece of property cheap, right on the edge of town, and then had immediately tried to bulldoze a small, privately owned family plot, a tiny, unlicensed cemetery that had been there since the 1890s. The family fought him tooth and nail, and Rourke eventually lost the suit, but not before he'd desecrated a few of the old markers trying to scare them off. He'd tried to evict the dead from their own ground. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. Maybe that was it. Maybe the earth remembered. Maybe the ground knew the difference between someone who respected its purpose and someone who treated it like cheap real estate to be bulldozed. It sounded ridiculous, but it was the only explanation that fit the sheer, violent rejection I had witnessed. I called Dale again late that afternoon, just before I had to leave for my shift. "Did Marty finish the Rourke plot?" I asked. "Yeah." Dale sounded tired. "Took him forever. We had to use twice the grout we expected. That hole went deep, Frank. It was weird. We poured the mix, and it was like the ground was sucking it down. We tried to tamp the dirt back, but it kept feeling spongy. We put down some heavy plywood over it just to stabilize it tonight. We'll look at putting the permanent marker down next week." Spongy, sucking it down. My stomach twisted. The earth was hungry, or maybe it was just determined. I drove back to Greenwood Cemetery that Thursday evening with a knot of pure dread in my gut. I packed my heaviest battery-powered lantern, 2 flashlights, and a short, stout shovel. Not for digging, but just as a heavy, comforting weight in my hand. When I punched in at 6, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just cold, it was oppressive. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere was pressing down on the ground, trying to hold something in place. I skipped the shed and the coffee. I drove straight to the newer section. I saw the plot immediately. The plywood Dale mentioned was gone, vanished. I stopped the Ranger about 20 feet away and cut the engine. The silence rushed in, but this time, it was vibrating with energy. It wasn't the rhythmic thump from the previous night, but a low, pervasive hum, like a distant transformer overloading. I got out, the shovel feeling heavy and awkward in my hand. The ground crew had done their best. The grave was flat now, heavily covered with new, dark topsoil and stabilized with the concrete grout beneath. But the stabilization hadn't held. The new dirt was cracked in a dozen places, not in fissures, but in wide, gaping mouths. It looked like a giant dark pie crust that had been baked too fast and split open. And in the center of the plot, where the hole had been, there was a raised dome. It wasn't a natural settlement dome. It was too perfectly round, too high. It looked like something massive had been pushing up directly from the center, bending the earth over it like a sheet of metal. And the temperature. I could feel the heat radiating off the dome. Not warm, but distinctly hot. In the freezing Iowa night, the soil was steaming faintly. I crept closer, shining my lantern. I could see the edges of the dome where the clay and the grout were meeting. The grout, which was supposed to be rock hard, was crumbling, powdered into dust. Then I saw the plywood. It wasn't gone. It had been violently thrown 30 feet away, leaning against a granite obelisk, shattered into 3 pieces. Whatever force had displaced the earth had done so with casual brutality. I stood there, staring at the steaming dome of dirt. This wasn't settling. This was war. The earth was expelling Tommy Rourke with physical force, generating heat and pressure to break the seals of the grave. I heard the sound then. It wasn't a groan or a whisper. It was a mechanical grinding noise, muffled but incredibly strong. Crack! It sounded like stone scraping against stone, or perhaps concrete against concrete. The vault. Whatever was inside that casket was moving the vault lid. The dome shuddered, A huge crack, wider than my hand, zipped across the top of the raised earth. I backed up until I hit the fender of the Ranger. I knew what was coming next. The whole thing was going to blow. I grabbed my radio and called dispatch, not caring how crazy I sounded. "Dispatch, this is Frank at Greenwood. I have an emergency situation at the new section. Massive ground disturbance. I need heavy equipment immediately. Call Dale. Tell him the Rourke grave is collapsing. And I mean violently collapsing." The dispatcher, a sleepy young woman named Carol, sounded confused. "A grave collapsing, Frank? Do you need police?" "No, not police. I need construction equipment. And tell Dale to bring the strongest floodlights he has. Something is moving the vault." I dropped the radio back into its cradle. I couldn't wait for Dale. I had to see what was happening. This wasn't just a sinkhole. This was an event. I raised the lantern and walked back toward the dome. As I did, the grinding sound stopped. The heat seemed to intensify, and the air smelled overwhelmingly of disturbed, hot clay. The dome didn't collapse. It stabilized for a moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, the soil at the very peak began to move. It wasn't exploding this time. It was being pushed aside. A large, dark object began to emerge from the dirt. It was slick, wet, and heavy. At first, I thought it was a piece of the broken plywood forced up through the soil. But as more of it appeared, I realized it was too thick, too curved. It was wood, old, heavy, stained wood. It was the corner of the casket. The pressure from below, or whatever was generating the force, was so intense that it was pushing the entire burial vault and the casket inside it straight up through the 6 feet of packed earth and concrete grout. I watched, horrified, as the mahogany corner broke free of the earth, followed by a foot or so of the side panel. It was scraping against the concrete walls of the vault, tearing up the surrounding dirt as it went. Then, the movement stopped again. The casket corner was sticking out of the ground like a grotesque dark splinter. Silence. The hum was gone. The grinding was gone. Just the sound of my own shallow breathing and the faint crackle of the cooling dirt. I approached cautiously. I needed to see how deep the break was. Was the whole vault moving? I shined the light down the side of the exposed wood. It was definitely the casket. It was dark, highly polished wood, probably sealed tight. As the light hit the wood, I saw it. And this is the detail that truly broke my sanity. The wood wasn't smooth, it was scored. Deep, ragged gouges ran across the surface as if someone had taken a sharp rock and scraped it frantically, repeatedly, from the inside. It wasn't just the earth trying to push Tommy Rourke out. Tommy Rourke was trying to claw his way out. I stumbled back, tripping over the shovel I had carried for protection. It clattered loudly on a nearby headstone. I looked at the exposed wood, imagining the frantic, desperate scratching sounds, muffled by the heavy wood and the clay. And then I heard it again. Not a whisper this time. It was a clear, sharp tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the wood, right where the casket corner met the dirt. It was rhythmic, insistent, like a fingernail hitting wood. I stood up, shaking, trying to process the impossible. He was alive? No. Tommy Rourke had a heart attack. He was certified dead. He was embalmed. But something was in that box, and it was awake. I took one step closer, compelled by a morbid curiosity that outweighed even the terror. I had to know what the tapping meant. Was it a signal? I was about 10 feet away when the tapping stopped, and the voice returned. It was louder this time, less muffled, because the casket was practically breaching the surface. It was still thick, wet, and guttural, but it was closer. It was a terrible, desperate plea. "Let me out! Please! I can't stay here!" It was Tommy Rourke, his voice, but corrupted, stripped of its usual slick confidence, reduced to sheer, terrified panic. And then, the voice changed. The fear vanished, replaced by a sudden, cold fury. "This isn't my place. This dirt won't have me. I didn't finish." The exposed casket corner shuddered violently. The grinding returned, louder than before, and the entire dome of earth began to split open further. I saw the ground moving rapidly, separating around the rising vault. And in the black space being created between the vault and the surrounding earth, I saw something else. Something slick and pale, moving rapidly in the dark. It was pale, and it was moving away from the rising casket like black water being displaced by a massive pale stone. The earth was trying to flee. That's when I understood the terrifying truth of the situation. It wasn't just that the earth was rejecting Tommy Rourke. It was that the earth was trying to get away from him, and whatever was trapped inside that box was furious that it couldn't be accepted, that it couldn't finish its stay. I turned and ran back to the Ranger, scrambling inside, fumbling for the keys. Just as the engine roared to life, a sound erupted from the grave that was not scratching, not groaning, and not talking. It was the sound of heavy wood splintering. Crack! The casket lid had burst open. I didn't look back. I jammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the wet gravel, and slammed the gas pedal down. I drove blind, fast, the lights of the Ranger slicing through the dark paths. I heard the last sound as I sped away from the new section, a sound that chased me across the cemetery grounds. It was a wet, heavy, sucking noise, immediately followed by a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. It wasn't Rourke's voice. It was a high-pitched, inhuman shriek, tearing through the night air, echoing off the marble angels and the ancient stones. It was the sound of something released that should have stayed buried, and it was calling my name. Frank! I drove blind. I didn't care about the speed limit, or the winding paths, or the centuries of stones I was rattling past. All that mattered was putting distance between me and that shriek. Frank! The sound wasn't just loud, it felt tailored, designed to pierce the thick glass and metal of the truck. It was Tommy Rourke's voice, yes, but stretched thin, soaked in mud, and backed by a reservoir of pure, unholy fury. I glanced wildly in the rearview mirror. The cemetery was pitch black behind me, a swirling mass of shadows and old oak trees. But then I saw it. It wasn't a figure. It was a disturbance. It looked like a low, wide wave of black water moving impossibly fast across the grass. The ground itself seemed to be boiling, tearing up sod and gravel as whatever had been Rourke, or whatever Rourke had become, pursued me. It was gaining. I slammed the brakes just long enough to wrench the steering wheel hard left onto the main asphalt drive that led to the front gates. The Ranger fishtailed, throwing a spray of mud against a marble angel, and then I straightened out and floored the gas again. The front gate, 600 yards away. I knew the rules. My job was to keep people in their designated plots. Right now, my only job was getting out. The iron gates loomed ahead, massive and locked with a heavy chain and a keypad. I needed my code. I needed 5 seconds of calm to punch in those numbers. I screeched to a halt right in front of the keypad box. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely feel the keys. I looked back one last time. The black wave was maybe 50 yards away, and it was coalescing. It was pulling itself together into a massive, wet, churning column of dirt and shadow. It was taller than a man, and it was moving with purpose. I stabbed the numbers. 17609. Beep. Wrong. Panic seized my throat. I had transposed the numbers. I could hear it now, a wet slapping sound like 1,000 heavy tongues tearing at the wet grass. I tried again. 17069. Beep, beep, beep. The chain on the gate began to rattle. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the massive iron barrier rolled open. I didn't wait for it to clear. I slammed the truck into drive, hit the gas, and the Ranger shot through the gap, scraping the passenger side mirror against the heavy iron post. I didn't care. Once I was through, I swerved hard, turning the truck around so the headlights shone directly back into the cemetery drive. The gates were still rolling open when the shape arrived. It wasn't Tommy Rourke, not in any recognizable way. It was a column of disturbed earth, wet clay clinging to something vaguely human-shaped inside, but the shape was constantly shifting, boiling, and reforming. It was pure, concentrated filth and fury. It hit the iron gate post with a wet thwump. I saw the thing, the dark, wet mass, stop dead at the threshold. It didn't pass through the gate. It couldn't. It stood there, vibrating, the column of mud and darkness stretching and contorting toward the street, and the horrible, wet shriek erupted again. "You can't leave me here! I am not finished!" I watched, frozen in the driver's seat, as the mass slammed itself against the heavy iron bars again and again, splattering mud and ancient clay everywhere. It was trapped by the boundary, confined to the land it had so violently rejected, and that land was now rejecting it in return. The attack wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the restriction. It was rage at the physical boundary that marked the edge of the place where he was forced to reside. I kept the headlights on it for another full minute until the sheer terror gave way to a cold, shaking dread. Finally, the churning mass seemed to deflate slightly, sinking back toward the ground, though it remained a massive, dark stain right inside the entrance. I took my foot off the brake and drove. I drove straight through Cedar Falls and kept going east until the sun was a faint, bruised purple on the horizon. I pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot in Waterloo, killed the engine, and just sat there, shaking, until the first rays of morning sunlight hit the windshield. Daylight. My savior. I couldn't just go home. I had to face the music. I had to report what had happened, or at least what I could make believable. I called Dale again, this time from the diner, drinking coffee that was weak and blessed. "Dale, it's Frank. You need to get out to Greenwood now. I mean, right now. Forget the backhoe. Bring the whole damn crew and the biggest dump truck you own." Dale was instantly alert this time. "Frank, what the hell happened? What was that call last night?" "The Rourke plot," I said, my voice hoarse. "It wasn't just collapsing, Dale. It was vandalism. Extreme vandalism. Someone broke in with heavy equipment, ruptured the vault, and it looks like they tried to steal the casket. The front gate is damaged, too. Something hit the post hard." I kept the description focused on crime and damage. I didn't mention the movement, the heat, or the screaming. "Steal the casket?" Dale sounded incredulous. "Why would anyone steal Tommy Rourke's casket?" "I don't know, Dale, but it's a disaster. The whole area is ruined." I drove back to Cedar Falls, meeting Dale and Marty at the cemetery entrance just after 8 a.m. The scene at the front gate told half the story for me. The heavy iron post was bent inward, and the ground around the gate was churned up, the asphalt scored with deep, wet tracks that looked like something massive had dragged itself across the pavement. "Jesus Christ, Frank," Dale muttered, staring at the damage. "That's not teenagers. That's a bulldozer without a driver." We drove back to the newer section. When we arrived at the Rourke plot, the site was worse than I had left it. The entire area was devastated. The dome of earth had completely collapsed, leaving a massive, jagged crater. The surrounding plots, the ones right next to Rourke's, looked dead. The grass was scorched brown, the soil dry and cracked, even though the rest of the cemetery was damp with morning dew. In the center of the crater, the concrete burial vault was split open like a melon. The heavy concrete lid was thrown 20 feet away, cracked down the middle. And the casket. The heavy mahogany casket was nowhere to be seen. The only thing remaining was a massive gaping hole that led straight down into the earth, ringed by splintered wood fragments and broken grout. Dale and Marty walked to the edge of the crater, peering into the abyss. "The whole vault is gone," Marty whispered, his usual jovial face pale. "The casket, the body, all of it. They went straight through the bottom." Dale knelt down, touching the scorched earth. "This isn't robbery, Frank. Robbers don't leave the earth looking like this. This looks like a lightning strike, only underground." I didn't argue. I just stood there watching the two men try to make sense of the incomprehensible destruction. They spent the next 3 days cleaning up the mess. They called the police, who treated it like a bizarre case of grave robbery gone wrong, but the forensics team found nothing. No tire tracks, no tools, just the inexplicable scorched violence of the ground. The Rourke family was contacted. They were angry, but mostly they were just relieved they didn't have to deal with Tommy anymore, even in death. They signed off on declaring the plot irreparably damaged and gave permission for the area to be sealed. Dale and Marty tried everything to fill the hole. They brought in tons of filled dirt, gravel, and concrete, but the ground refused to hold it. I watched them on my last day. They'd pour in a truckload of gravel, and by morning the level would have dropped 3 feet. It was exactly as I had seen it. The earth was sucking it down, refusing to accept anything placed there. The ground had made its statement. Tommy Rourke was not welcome, and anything associated with his final resting place was equally unwelcome. The problem wasn't Tommy Rourke's body. The problem was his presence. The ground knew he was a desecrator, a man who tried to evict the ancient dead, and it had reacted accordingly. It had used its own power, pressure, heat, and sheer force to expel the foreign object. On Saturday morning, I handed Dale my uniform and my keys. "I'm done, Dale," I said simply. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He looked exhausted, haunted by the crater that wouldn't fill. "I don't blame you, Frank," he said, shaking my hand. That place is wrong now. I don't know what happened, but I know I don't want to be here when it happens again." I drove away from Greenwood Cemetery that morning and never looked back. I moved down to Arizona, found a job working maintenance at a golf course. Nice, green, living grass. I stick to the daylight hours, but sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when I'm alone in the deep, quiet hours of the night, I think about Tommy Rourke. They never found the casket. They never found the body. The local story is that a rival in the used car business stole the remains for revenge. But I know the truth. The grounds crew eventually fenced off the Rourke plot with heavy chain link and put up a sign that read, "Danger, unstable land. Keep out." It's the only place in that ancient cemetery that isn't quiet. It's the only place where the ground shifts, and the air feels thin, and the shadows seem to move just a little too fast. Tommy Rourke, the low-grade crook who tried to evict the dead, was himself evicted. The earth would not have him. And I know he's still out there, somewhere in that dark, cold patch of land, trapped between the world of the living and the accepted silence of the dead. He is still furious, still scraping, still trying to find a piece of ground, any ground, that will finally give him rest. And sometimes, late at night, when the coyotes howl and the wind sounds like a desperate shriek, I still hear that voice, wet and filled with rage, echoing across the miles, reminding me that the earth may have won the battle, but the one they buried there is very much still awake. "Frank!"